Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadri, your instructor for this International Political Economy course. And what we are going to do today is we are going to focus on Module 2. And Module 2, as you know, the title of it, according to the book, is Liberalism. But I want to first of all clear some very important issue. When we talk about liberalism, this is not the same as what nowadays many people refer to, for example, the Democratic Party, because they say, oh, the Democrats are very liberal, etc. In this case, what we are really talking about is we are talking about classical liberalism. Is that right? Classical liberalism is also known as what, as something nowadays we would call conservatism. So but the turn of the century, from 19th to the 20th, little by little, those labels, they change meaning. So here what I did was to clarify that one for you a little bit better, so you don't get confused by what are chapter and other readings are maybe talking about. I put it right there that liberalist or classical liberalism, which is the contemporary conservatism. Is that right? So these would be the ideas that nowadays we associate with the conservative, but it's based on the works of a lot of what we call classical liberals, people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and others, which we are going to describe some of them very, very soon. Is that right? And as usual, as you can see, we have, beside the chapter from the book that you're reading, we have also some companion articles. When I say companion, it doesn't mean there's some articles are always supporting exactly what the authors of your chapter talking about. It's because, as always, I wanted to make sure that you have options. Is that right? You're not exposed to only one perspective. There is no one perspective on everything. There is no one solution to everything. So I wanted you to be, exposed to different ideas about that notion. And one of the other things I'd like to emphasize is, for example, look at that article about the Yunus article about the Grameen Bank. Is that right? That is basically focusing on the notion of what we call, conservatism, capitalism, etc. Is that right? In the modern world. So if you're thinking that some of the ideas we're talking about is really good for maybe that 19th or the 20th century and doesn't apply to now, you would see that those ideas, they work even in the 21st century, and in areas that they do not have necessarily a lot of capital. Is that right? And as you remember, capital can consist of what? Cash, credit, assets, anything that is valuable, and you can use it for an exchange. Okay, so this is the this is our module 2, and as always, as you can see right there, you see that the module starts with the description. It goes to our reading. It goes to the samples and the instruction necessary for the discussion posting. It goes to the PowerPoint, and then right here is where they're going to embed our lecture. So you will, as you're watching my lecture, you're also looking at what? Your PowerPoint. Okay? So having said that one, now let's go to our PowerPoint. Well, we have a PowerPoint which is rather extensive. Why? Because the topic was very, very extensive in itself. So we start with what we call overview, or some people call introduction, and then we go to the roots of the liberal perspective. Again, remember, every time we say liberal, we mean what? Classical liberals, and the liberal views of IR, or international relation, and of course we talk about Mill and John Stuart Mill. Is that right? And the evolution of liberalism, and to talk about John Maynard Keynes and the Great Depression, and even talk about the notion of conservatism and resurgence of the classical, liberalism, and then we go to what? New conservatism, which I think their best example was, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, two different sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Is that right? Two major leaders. And then we talk about globalization, and the liberal perspective, okay? And last but not least, we conclude. So as you can see, this goes way beyond what usually the 5-point scale that we talk about. Of course, you can collapse this one to that 5-point scale. Is that right? But I thought we are still at the beginning of our semester. The material is extensive. A lot of students, they want me to make sure that, you know, they have the big picture. Is that right? Because as long as I provide you with a big picture, I don't go to all the details that the book and each one of the articles are talking about, then you have an idea that when you're reading it, okay, this is how I should understand it. And as always, how do we treat our PowerPoints? Like a study guide, is that right? Study guide for not just the quizzes and exams and obviously what? Final exam one day as well. Okay, having said that one, now let's start. Okay. So here we go. In terms of the overview, what is the nature of liberalism, and then the definition of it and the types of it and everything. Let me tell you a little bit about the nature of liberalism. If you remember when we talked about mercantilism, mercantilism sounded like a very pessimistic approach. Do you remember? You know, we said something like, you know, they look at a zero-sum game, which is my winning is your loss and your winning is my loss, and there is one winner, and kind of pessimistic about the world and cooperation and everything else. No, liberalism has a very positive image. For example, the type of games that they would, suggest is what they call a win-win type of game. Is that right? A game that everybody can win a little bit. Okay, so that is very important. Now, in terms of the definition of it, I noticed that your text is giving one definition, and then we have each one of the authors, they're looking at it in a different way. You can choose whichever you like, you know, and if you do not like any of them and you want to come up with your own, that's fine, as long as it's a complete definition. Because here, just remember, with liberalism, the unit of analysis is individual. If you remember with mercantilism, they're talking about state policy this way, state policy that way. Is that right? Well, here, the issue is what? Here, the issue focuses basically on what? On individual. Because the assumption is if you free the individual in terms of their, fears of the government control and freedom of speech and everything else, is that right? When all these free individuals, they they act collectively, society as a whole is better off. Now, remember, this is a what? This is an assumption, is that right? It doesn't necessarily mean that whatever they say is exactly what you should expect. But this is a part of this theory, is that right? Okay, so I mentioned about the definition. You're free to think about it in any way you like. And then in terms of the liberalism, types, well, like anything else, we're going to talk about it. Is that right? The neoliberalism versus the classical one versus conservatism, others, we would mention that one. There are obviously different types. Now, let's go and start with what? With our Roman numeral 2, the roots of liberal perspective. In terms of the history of it, I'd like to start by giving an example, actually, of a relatively a modern leader. Is that right? Václav Havel was the first president of Czechoslovakia, and this is like what? President of Czechoslovakia after what? After the demise of Soviet Union. We're not talking about before 1990 period. Is that right? We are talking about after 1990. And then what he saw, he said something about liberalism in terms of the tyranny of state is not a good thing. Is that right? And guess what? And he was an artist, okay? He was an artist. He was not a typical politician. He was an artist looking at the political economic system in terms of, because remember, during the Soviet period, what? These guys, they have all, closed economy, Marxist economy, etc., in which, individual doesn't have the right, is that right? And there is no free enterprise, there is no, personal properties or anything else. Everything is public, everything is this, everything is that right? Everybody is basically a worker just for the state. So he was looking at that system as a terrible system. You see what I mean? And when you're thinking about it, many of his ideas, and of course because it's happening in the 20th century, is that right? I know that was way beyond probably your time, but this is very interesting because he was basically echoing the ideas of one of the major, if not the major, but one of the major thinkers of liberalism, Adam Smith. Is that right? In The Wealth of the Nation, that he's talking about the value of classical liberalism, or what nowadays we call capitalism. Is that right? Individual rights, private property, freedom from government, restrictions and all that. You see what I mean? So we will talk about the evolution of that. So that is very interesting to start with. Then in terms of capitalism, is that right? The notion of self-interest, that is one of the main notion of capitalism, that it works based on, you look at yourself, what is good for me, is that right? As opposed to, what is good for the society, which was the perspective that Howell was going against. And then in terms of the notion of invisible hand. Well, Adam Smith suggested that if you provide all these opportunities for individual, do not worry about what's going to happen, because as individuals that are working in this regard and are obviously rational individuals and making right decisions. Now, who's a rational individual? An individual is a rational individual that tries to maximize his or her benefits and minimize his or her costs. Now, cost not just in monetary term. Cost could be time. Is that right? The time you spend in finishing a task. If you're minimizing that one and you're still producing a high quality, product or a good at a lower price, well, here we go. You're doing very well. So he said that when all these individuals are working together, there is something called invisible hand, according to his theory, is that right? That this invisible hand naturally brings that balance to the society. Okay? So that's one of the major concepts of what, classical liberalism, which, the result of it is basically capitalism. Is that right? So here we go. So liberalism focuses on what? Cooperative behavior, as I mentioned before. It focuses on what we call rational choice, as I kind of mentioned it earlier. Is that right? And then the whole notion of self-interest. So rational person maximizes what? His or her benefit, minimizes his or her what? Cost, and not just monetary, but also non-monetary factors as well. And again, works with what? A notion of invisible hand. What else we can say? We can say that also there is an emphasis on negative and positive rights and democracy. And these are rights that, some of the rights that you have, like natural rights, that, freedom of speech, this and that, and negative rights, like for example, freedom from, being harassed by the government, you see. Now, a more detailed discussion of that one is not only in the chapter, but also some of the articles they talk about it. I don't want to go to details because we're not going to have time to talk about everything. So I'm just highlighting everything for you so you know where everything goes. Is that right? And of course, those rights could lead to a democracy or not. Is that right? And democracy obviously enjoys that. So the tenet of capitalism is, number one, from agriculture moving to industries and services. Is that right? Because remember, we talked about this one before as well, that every economy has basically three sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. Obviously, in terms of human, growth and development and the societal, development, we know that all the societies were agrarian societies. They basically were, many of the ancient civilizations where they grew around the rivers, because not only they were providing them with water, but also for themselves, but also for the crops and everything. And the crops were there to produce food for the society and the population and everything. So they were agrarian societies. Is that right? And then little by little, after the industrial, period of enlightenment, at least in Europe, and then industrialization, they moved to industries, and obviously nowadays services are very, very important. So the private property is also very important. The notion of competition is very important. Is that right? And of course, what we call laissez-faire, a beautiful French expression, basically means let it be. Let it be what? Let it be free from government intervention. Okay, so here we go. We go to the next one, and here we are talking about the liberal views of IR, international relations. So liberalism's basic ideas are, for example, in terms of the David Ricardo. David Ricardo was a British guy, okay? And then he was very much into, obviously, he was a scholarly type, so he would actually even write as well, but he was also an entrepreneur too. So he talked basically about international trade. And one of the things he said was, trade is good for everybody. Now, remember, mercantilists were not like that. The type of trade they like is a type of trade that they can sell more, so they can earn hard currency or cash or whatever, and then they would, buy less from outside, so they don't have to share all of the money that they made with everybody else, you see? Because remember, they were thinking zero-sum game. Well, here, Liberalism suggests trade as much as possible. Why? Because it's good for everybody. It's good for exporter, it's good for importer, it's good for producer, it's good for what? Consumer. And one of the things they talked about is if you keep the society away from government restriction, is that right? Societies, they really focus on each one of the society, they have what they call comparative advantage. In other words, every society either has a land or labor force or some capital or some particular technology or something. They can produce certain type of products better than others. Classical example for this one, usually in economic courses, we are teaching international political economy, but borrowing from economic courses is countries that they are very good in producing red wine as opposed to countries that are better in producing white wine, like German white wine versus, for example, French red wine. Well, they're basically next door to each other. Is that right? They're bordering one another. But the way the ground and sun and everything else is, and over centuries, the technologies that their farmers have developed, the French are much better, significantly in producing red wines, and the Germans are much better in producing white wines. So, well, what about the consumers? The consumers, they would like to have what? They would like to have, options. Is that right? And also, sometimes they have a particular taste. Some people like red, some people like white, some people like pink, some people like that, some people, you see what I mean? So everybody has different tastes. So as a result of that comparative advantage that naturally states have, what Ricardo thought they would be better off. This should not be a surprise for you. I already mentioned that they're thinking a positive sum game, and if you recall, positive sum game is a type of game in which both sides can feel a winner. We're not talking about equal winners, but winner. Okay, now what's the next? The next thing is the fear of state and power concentration. Fear of state because they think sometimes states, they make too many rules and regulation. Now remember the classical example when for example in Great Britain, the protectionists, is that right, mercantilists, they basically went away, is that right, corn laws, corn laws and everything else. First of all, they were forcing feudalists that they were producing a lot of the agricultural products because they could not compete sometimes with the product coming from the rest of the European continent. So they forced the British government to have all those tariffs. Is that right? Mercantilists love tariffs. Okay, I know some of our current leaders, they love tariffs. That's a mercantilist approach. No liberal or capitalist in the right mind would ever say, "Oh, I'm for tariffs." That's not going to happen. Is that right? Among our founding fathers, we had also, Alexander Hamilton, who was very much for that, for tariff too. If you remember, we talked about Hamilton and Frederick List in the previous lecture. So that's one of their fears. And the other notion is concentration of power. When political power is concentrated in one or two institutions, they think that's another positive thing. So then here we go with the Britain's corn laws. Is that right? The example I was giving you in 1815, established by the landlord. Is that right? Landlord and landowners in Great Britain, because they could not compete. By about 30 years later, actually technically 31 years later, by 1846, the liberal triumph versus the mercantilists in Great Britain, and that's the first victory of them. So then after that we go to what? After that one, we are going to focus, let me just make sure that, the system is not failing us. All right. We go to John Stuart Mill and evolution of liberalism. For IP, as you know, is a dynamic field. So liberalism is that way as well. Now, if you look at some people who are very, very extremist, sometimes they call John Stuart Mill the first, classical liberals who betrayed the capitalism. That's not true. Okay? That is not true. That's not true because, he was a liberal and all of his thoughts and everything else was very, very similar to Adam Smith and David Ricardo. But he observed something during a very, very sensitive period of time in, around the world in industrial countries. And he noticed that with all these industrial things happening on, it seems like, and the capitalism growing, there is like a gap in the society. And the gap between rich and poor is not narrowing, which is what we would like to see. Is that right? Because there was really not a middle class at that time, very honest with you. They were either rich or they're poor. And then like maybe about, even if you're being very generous, 10% of the population are rich, 90% are all poor. Is that right? So then what he noticed that there is nothing wrong with it from his perspective as a liberal person to, provide education for the children. So because these children, they become educated, they become in future better workers, they can produce better goods and services and everything else. So that was one of the things that he thought maybe states should invest a little bit in public education. The other thing he was worried about was, what about all those people that for decades they worked, is that right? And then what? They have nothing else to show because it's the end of their life, they're retired, etc., etc. And they, if they don't have any children or their children are dead, sometimes the children would die, so way before their parents, okay? So who's going to take care of them? The poor, is that right? So the poor people, older, etc., etc. He said, well, maybe the government should provide some benefits for them too, because they contributed to the establishment of the country and the growth of the country. So those are the two major things he talked about, is that right, in that regard. And these are the two that some very, very extremist, classical liberals, sometimes they have, they complained about, okay? But nowadays we take it for granted because in every single country in the world, the government directly or indirectly, they would promote education and somehow they provide subsidies for it. And then also they provide social security. What do you think social security is for? Is that right? We were among all the industrial countries actually the last one that had social security in 1935, act of the Congress. But so a lot of the industrial countries. So this is very frankly, this is kind of non-issue, but it's a part of the growth of the ideas of liberalism, because classical liberalism or capitalism doesn't have things like that. Okay, we think, oh yeah, capitalism, oh that's good, still we have social security, we have national health or, insurance or, vacation days and, child labor laws, no. That doesn't exist in really classical pure capitalism. Okay, so it also favored markets and individual action. So as you can see, he's going based on the same tradition. And then also limited state action when market fails. So it says, look, this invisible hand is supposed to, that Adam Smith was talking about, is supposed to work, but sometimes it seems like a little bit too invisible. Because even at that time, before they start going to something that we experienced in the 20th century, is that right? Human beings, they experienced in that one, which was Great Depression, okay? So these, business cycles, sometimes they don't work very well, sometimes because it's supposed to cycle between unemployment and inflation, is that right? Or sometimes what happens is you have both unemployment and inflation. Then what are you going to do? We're talking about Great Depression, is that right? So he said, so sometimes maybe the states, they should do something about it. But he was kind of mild about it. He didn't go as far as some of the people who came after him. And the difference is, so here you can see some differences between like mercantilist approach and liberal approach. Because remember, mercantilists, they were really for any kind of state action. You see what I mean? And liberals, they say, no, take it easy. Is that right? Just when it's really necessary. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And here we go. The guy that some people really hated, John, Maynard Keynes. Well, he was around the time and he observed Great Depression. And as I mentioned, that cycle, wait a minute, I'm a capitalist, but how could this happen? So when he saw that one, then he thought market could have serious failures. Is that right? And because of that, he suggested state action is necessary to what? To adjust market failures. He didn't say, let's get rid of capitalism or classical, liberalism and replace it with Marxism. That's not true. Anybody who says that, you should know that this is wrong, okay? He just said that state an emergency, is that right? Like for example, you're driving your car with 4, tires, and one of them gets flat. Okay, you have a spare tire, so spare tire. But do you drive your car every day with a spare tire? No, is that right? So put a spare tire for a period of time. You take it over there. You fix it flat, and you put the regular one back on. Is that right? So here we go. This is what he's talking about. So it's as a matter of desperation that state has to act, not like, oh yeah, this is number one rule, So then there is the whole notion of the paradox of thrift and, rational individual versus irrational society. He also questions something else, because remember, Adam Smith was talking about what is good for an individual is good for the society. Individuals are rational. Yes, individuals are rational. They try to maximize. But if every individual acts completely rationally, it sometimes leads to irrational behavior in societies. Like what? Like, for example, I grew up in Arizona. In the western part of our country, there are a lot of land that the government owns. Guess what? These lands are not all desert the way some people from East think. They think, oh, all the western part of the country, they're desert, because they think about parts of New Mexico, parts of Arizona, parts of Texas. Is that right? No, there are lands that is, it's full of, plants and animals and everything else. So in that part of the country, we also have a lot of ranchers. Is that right? The ranchers that they take their cows, and some people have sheep, some people have goats, but most of them, they have cows. Is that right? So the government does this. It says, okay, we would allow you to, for example, to produce your meat and everything else, because, you need to feed the animals. All right? You can use these government land, this much time, that much time, etc., etc. Now, think about it from the perspective of pure capitalism and the individual who is irrational. Is that right? If an individual knows the biggest expense they have, which is feeding their animals, is that right? It's going to come out free. What would they do? They would buy as many animals as possible so they can use that and they can sell that and make more money. Now, guess what's going to happen to that land? If every single person thinks that way and does that way, which, by the way, has happened. I'm not telling you anything, hypothetical. Is that right? There are lands in western part of the country that they got demolished because of this, because some people simply abuse it. Land has to have time for the grass to grow, because, for example, usually the cows, they eat from the top of the grass, and you put the sheep over there, they eat kind of middle part of the grass. You put the goat after that, they go all the way down to the level of the level of the ground, and sometimes those grass, they don't come back, which means what? They don't come back. Next rain that comes washes off the surface, which we call what? Topsoil. That's the valuable stuff. Is that right? Washes off that one. The land which was fertile becomes what? Desert. How do you think deserts grow? Out of nowhere? That's how it is. So that's why, as a whole, even though individuals were rational and they did maximize their benefits or something, as a whole, the society loses a what? A very important natural resource. That's what they're talking about. I want you to remember that one. So Keynes came out with also a compromise, a balance between state action and also international relations. Because remember, it was talking about, maybe with the Great Depression, maybe the government has to do something temporary. Let's say maybe some kind of government rules or regulations. So this goes beyond what? This paradox of the theft or something. So he said state would act, but again, not, for example, forever, temporary. In the domestic part, so the domestic part, you're focusing on your producers, if they're agricultural producers, if they're industrial producers or something, or service producers. And then internationally, everybody should still want trade freely. So he was not also for tariffs in that form. Is that right? But some kind of government help. So in that regard, after World War II, is that right? We have the birth of the, as you know, the reading talks about it, Bretton Woods system. And the Bretton Woods system was basically based on that Keynesian compromise. Inside the country, the governments can help a little bit, is that right? To get the producers going, especially after World War II, when Europe was basically leveled, Japan was leveled. Many part of the, we Americans were so lucky, is that right? The only place during World War II that we got, part of our territory that got damaged was what? Pearl Harbor, basically one naval base in Hawaii, is that right? The rest of the country was fine, okay? So we were producing, it was the best time in our life, because our, basically, unemployment was pretty much like zero. This has never ever happened before. Unemployment zero. People are working. People are getting education. You see what I mean? Our industrial, base is excellent. So in that regard, they tried with Bretton Woods system. They tried to establish that one to bring a balance between the government action in the society, in their own, domestic area, as opposed to, interaction between states has to be still pure capitalism from their perspective. So here we have also the notion of the liberals in terms of hegemon. And what is the definition? Hegemon, and it goes based on the notion of hegemonic stability theory. Is that right? The idea is that from a capitalistic perspective, there is no problem to have a great power that has, when we say great power, obviously one sign of it would be their military. Is that right? They think historically Great Britain has played that role in the modern period. Why? Because it had a navy, and their navy was producing what? Of course, they didn't do that one just to help the entire planet Earth. Is that right? They were doing that one because they were managing their colonies and everything. But at the same time, because the navy was everywhere, it was getting rid of the pirates and this and that, and was providing security, which is one of the important issues for people who are interested in trade. If there is no security, you're not going to trade. Is that right? If you're shipping your car somewhere and then somewhere in the middle of the, I don't know, seas or something happened to those, or somebody steals or something, you don't feel, secure. You're not going to trade that way. Is that right? So to promote that one. So a hegemon provides that security and also usually provides a reliable currency. So British pound played that role for a couple of centuries. Is that right? And then after World War II, when we Americans, we entered in a very direct way international politics and the global politics and everything else, and we were one of the two major superpowers, American dollars became, replaced what basically British pound in that regard. So we, with our military and this, so that's the role that we have played. So from liberal perspective, that's positive. Of course, some people, they don't think that was such a positive thing, but that's the different perspectives. All right, here we go. The next slide is talking about conservatism and resurgence of classical. In 1950s and 60s, we see as the societies that are basically rebuilding themselves, there's a backlash against Keynesian liberal perspective. They say, well, wait a minute, he was talking about these things, but it's not necessary anymore. You see what I mean? So let's go back to the original idea of capitalism and liberalism when incentive was bringing, ingenuity and growth and everything. So here you talk about, for example, people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, very important economists and everything. So Hayek is talking about the slippery slope of, empowered state, state that has, access to this and access to that and can tax you and can, restrict you and this and that. Little by little from behind the scene can come in. So that's not good from a capitalistic perspective. Friedman was talking about the danger of power concentration or concentration of power, whichever you like to refer it to, because they think that would eventually work against capitalistic perspective. So in this regard, we have a new resurgence, and this is when we start really hearing the term conservatism. In other words, let's conserve the older liberal, classical liberal or capitalistic ideas. Okay, that's what I want you to remember. So resurgence of the classical liberalism in that regard. All right, let's move on to the next slide. The next slide is talking about neo-conservatism. Is that right? So conservatives were one group, but there were some people who were considering themselves neo-conservative because they think some of these ideas are okay, some of them they need revision. Is that right? So this is associated particularly with two major political leaders, Ronald Reagan especially in 1980s. Is that right? Ronald Reagan in the U.S. and Margaret Thatcher in the Great Britain. What did they believe in? They believed in the classical liberalism influence, in their time period, which was 1980s. Okay, and then these are sometimes also called neocons. Is that right? Neocons policies involves three major things. Look, this could be a nice short little, short little essay, I can make an essay out of it, but short answer question. For example, I could ask, what are the three major points of, or three major ideas of neocon policies? So you would say privatization of state-run, companies. Very easy to understand. Is that right? If something is owned by the, if the company is owned by the government, you just basically offer the stock of it in the stock market. You privatize them. Is that right? You let private people to buy the stocks of it. Then deregulation or decreasing state market, role. Is that right? And last but not least, what many of these people have been talking about, tax cuts. Because over time, the governments, not just in the U.S., all over, they started taxing more and more because people, they had expectation of, I want you to provide me with education. I want you to provide me with insurance. I want you to provide me with retirement. I want you to provide me with this. Well, guess what? How is the government going to do this? They can't just print, money. You keep printing money, what's going to happen? You're going to increase inflation. Is that right? So they would say, okay, you want these things? No problem. We tax you, and then from that tax, you would see it on your paychecks. Is that that right? The part that, for example, says this or that, is the government, federal government, deduction. Now, in state of Florida, we just see federal government deduction. Is that right? Because we don't pay state income tax. Well, when I was in other states like Virginia, like Arizona, or like, California, guess what? They have state tax. And then also, in addition to federal, state, sometimes there is a county tax. Sometimes there is a city tax, So you tax, basically, you pay a service for the benefits that what you're getting. So, but by that time, by 1980s, the neoconservatives, they thought there is just too much tax collected by the government. Let's put the system back. Is that right? So there was a lot of tax cut. And who got the benefit? Most of them, the richer people. Is that right? Because the poor people, they didn't get much of a benefit from that anyway. Then the neocons and the recovery of the 1980s and 90s. And that's another important topic that, as you notice, what our reading is covering. Now we go to what? Globalization and liberalism. Okay, so U.S. championed the globalization in 1980s, because they thought it was very good to do all of this all over the world. What is good for us is good for you, and we are all connected and interconnected and trade and everything else, and this is all part of globalization. Well, guess what? Globalization is not just economic. It's also political. It's also cultural. It's other dimensions. So there were some people who were not happy, but that was one of our, basically points. So to generate growth and benefits for what? For poor. This is what the assumption is. Is this really true or not? There are studies about this. Globalization is characterized as, 1, economic process to what? Integrate markets. 2, political process to weaken states. 3, culture process, connecting values and beliefs and those type of things. See what I'm talking about? Okay, now we move on in the 1990s, globalization. People, by the time we get to 1990s, a decade later, some people say globalization has positive things. Some people say it has negative things. Very frankly, it's true. There is no one phenomenon on this planet that is all positive. Is that right? So it has that both. And then, in relationship, and as a contradiction to process of globalization, a lot of people were talking about localization. Instead of globalization, localization. All right. So you see that reading talks about that too. The last slide I'm going to cover right here is our conclusion. So in that regard, what can we say about what? Classical liberalism or conservatism and capitalism and everything. What we can say? We can say that, in terms of the economic liberalism today, there are some observation we can make, some general observation. Number 1, the liberals now, they are still true to the core ideas of Adam Smith. Is that right? So individual rights, freedom from the state, etc. Liberalism has had already evolved too. We know that pure capitalism of, that started basically from 16th century and grew so much into 18th century, and then 18th and 19th century basically promoted the whole notion of imperialism. Is that right? Colonialism. When those great European powers, they went everywhere and they tried to grab as much land and everything else as possible, etc., etc. And sometimes got them to fight and everything. But at the same time, it showed that when capitalism grows in the society, guess what happens? Yes, it's very good in terms of incentives. Is that right? Because it has a selfish perspective. You're thinking about you. I'm thinking about me. Even though I give a lip service that what I'm doing is just good for everybody, but it's really good for me or you. You see what I mean? It doesn't have that collective perspective. So because of that, deficiency, is that right? It's interesting that, and it's necessary from time to time that government provides certain services or watch out for some stuff. You see what I mean? So that's basically what today is. So today when they talk about capitalism, they forget that this is not pure capitalism. The system we have is not really pure capitalism. All right? I think the Europeans, they have a better term for it. They call it social welfare system. We are just a more free, we are the freer version of the social welfare. Is that right? We are not like the Europeans or even Canadians, but still, it's not pure capitalism. You can't talk like this with general public though. I've had some former students that after these lectures and reading about it, they talk and they get into the fight and they say, see, I knew when you go to college, you're going to become a communist. It's not true. Is that right? But so you just need to know as a highly educated American. Okay, so liberalism still is, has evolved and everything. Also, the liberal hour. When you think about market, how markets fragile they are, how democracy is fragile, we can see that, for example, the demise of Soviet Union. What did it show? The demise of Soviet Union basically showed that capitalism, capitalistic countries, that they have grown so much more, and they provided democracy, is that right, to the population. They have provided better quality of life. Of course, we're talking materialistically, is that right? Everybody has a car, home, this, that, eat food. Not everybody. There's always, in every society, there is a portion of the society that is not benefiting. But as a result of all this, we have a very strong middle class, and that's important. Okay, that's very important, because if you wanted to live in a society that 10% are rich and then 90% are poor, that's a recipe for a disaster. Is that right? And that would lead to a different topic that I cover in other courses. All right, I cover in my revolution course. And 90% eventually are going to come and get you. So here we go. So the liberal hour, it realizes that, and also in terms of ordeal liberalism, which is basically focusing on the market, is embedded in the legal and political system. So basically, we are talking about evolution of liberalism and what we have and how it is and its benefit and its shortcoming, like anything else. All right, this was a rather longer lecture because the topic was so sophisticated. But if you have questions, as always, what do? You email me. Thank you.